I never thought I'd be the woman who stares at a blank wall in the middle of the night, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, wondering how her entire life managed to splinter into a million jagged pieces in the span of a single evening. You see these stories online, or you hear about them through a friend of a friend, and you always think, not me. You think you're smarter than that. You think your marriage is built on something solid, something unshakable, like concrete and rebar. But the truth is, betrayal doesn't usually crash through your front door with a sledgehammer. It sneaks in through the cracks you didn't even know were there, wearing a familiar smile and carrying a suitcase. My husband David and I had been married for 4 years. We bought a charming little mid-century ranch house in the suburbs of Austin, Texas. It had a big backyard with an old oak tree, a kitchen that we spent 6 months remodeling ourselves, and a living room filled with furniture we'd picked out together on lazy Saturday afternoons. David is an industrial engineer, a man of logic, precision, and quiet dedication. He's the kind of guy who wakes up at 5 in the morning to brew a perfect pot of coffee, who leaves little sticky notes on the bathroom mirror telling me I'm beautiful, and who works himself to the bone to make sure we're building a secure future. I loved him for his stability. In a world that always felt chaotic, David was my anchor. But then there was Marcus.
Marcus wasn't an anchor. He was a storm. He had been my best friend since our freshman year at Ohio State. We had survived terrible college apartments, brutal breakups, and the general anxiety of trying to figure out who we were in our early 20s. Marcus was loud, charismatic, incredibly handsome in that effortless, messy way, and fiercely loyal. Or so I thought. He was the guy who could walk into a crowded room of strangers and leave with 10 new best friends. When Marcus split up with his long-term girlfriend and lost his apartment in Dallas all in the same week, he called me in a complete panic. He sounded smaller than I'd ever heard him, completely broken down by the sudden collapse of his life. Without even hesitating, I told him he could come stay with us. David, being the generous and trusting man he is, agreed immediately. We had a comfortable guest room, but Marcus insisted on taking the living room couch, saying he didn't want to overstay his welcome or make us feel crowded. He promised it would only be for a couple of weeks until he found a new place and got back on his feet. For the first few weeks, it was actually fun. It felt like a throwback to our college days. Marcus would cook these massive, elaborate dinners for us. We'd open a bottle of wine, and the three of us would sit on the back patio talking until the stars came out. David and Marcus got along surprisingly well. They'd watch football on Sundays, argue about sports statistics, and talk about cars.
I remember sitting on the kitchen counter, watching them laugh together in the living room, feeling this immense wave of gratitude. I had a wonderful husband, a beautiful home, and my best friend was getting his life back together under our roof. It felt perfect. Too perfect, looking back. The shift happened gradually, so subtly that I didn't even notice the temperature changing until I was already burning. David's company started a major infrastructure project out in Phoenix, which meant he had to fly out every Monday morning and wouldn't return until late Thursday night. Suddenly, the house felt incredibly quiet. Except it wasn't empty. It was just me and Marcus. At first, we maintained our boundaries. I'd come home from my job at the marketing agency, Marcus would be out looking for apartments or working remotely from the dining room table, and we'd have a casual dinner before retiring to our respective spaces. But loneliness is a strange thing. It amplifies the silence. One Tuesday night, about 3 weeks into David's travel schedule, a massive thunderstorm rolled through Austin. The power went out, plunging the house into total darkness. I stumbled out of the bedroom with my phone flashlight, only to find Marcus already in the kitchen, lighting a few candles he'd found in the pantry. We ended up sitting on the living room floor, drinking whiskey straight from the bottle, listening to the rain violently lash against the windows. The candlelight threw long, dancing shadows across the walls. We started talking, really talking, in a way we hadn't since college. Marcus looked at me, his eyes dark and intense, and told me how much he admired what David and I had. He said he was envious of the life I'd built, and that he felt like a total failure compared to us. There was a raw vulnerability in his voice that tugged at something deep inside me. I comforted him, leaning in close, telling him how incredible he was, how any woman would be lucky to have him. When my hand brushed against his knee, a sudden electric jolt shot up my spine. I ignored it, pulling my hand away quickly, blaming it on the alcohol. But the air in the room had changed. It felt thick, heavy with an unspoken tension that hadn't been there before. Over the next 2 weeks,
The boundaries began to blur. It started with small things. Marcus would stay in the kitchen longer while I was making breakfast, wearing nothing but gray sweatpants, his broad shoulders leaning against the doorframe. We'd catch each other staring a second too long. When we watched movies on the couch, we sat closer together than we used to, our shoulders touching, the warmth of his body radiating against mine. I told myself it was fine. He was my best friend. We were just comfortable with each other. But I was lying to myself, and deep down, I knew it. Every time David called me from his hotel room in Phoenix, asking about my day and telling me how much he missed me, I felt a sharp, twisting pang of guilt in my chest. I'd look over at Marcus, who would be sitting across the room watching me with an unreadable expression, and my heart would race for all the wrong reasons. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. David wasn't supposed to be home until midnight because of a delayed flight. I had an incredibly stressful day at the office, dealing with a client who had threatened to pull their account. When I walked through the front door, I was exhausted, stressed, and on the verge of tears. Marcus took one look at my face, walked over, and without a word, pulled me into a tight hug. It wasn't a friendly hug. It was deep, consuming, and desperate. I should have pulled away. I should have thought of David, of our marriage, of our home. But in that moment, I was weak, and the intoxicating scent of Marcus's cologne completely overwhelmed my senses. When he pulled back just enough to look down into my eyes, I didn't look away. He leaned down and kissed me. It was a slow, deliberate kiss that tasted like a boundary being permanently crossed. My mind screamed at me to stop, but my body completely betrayed me. I kissed him back, pouring all of my pent-up stress, loneliness, and confusion into him. We stumbled backward toward the sofa, our hands frantically moving under each other's clothes, completely lost in the heat of a moment that had been building for weeks. The guilt was suffocating, but the thrill was blinding. We were reckless, desperate, and completely consumed by each other, right there in the middle of the living room that my husband had worked so hard to provide for us. Then, the sudden, sharp sound of a key turning in the front door lock shattered the silence of the house. The sound of that key sliding into the brass lock was like a gunshot echoing through the house. For a fraction of a second, the world completely stopped spinning. Time dilated, stretching out into this agonizing, hyper-vivid nightmare. Marcus froze above me, his chest heaving, his eyes widening into pools of absolute terror. My heart didn't just race. It slammed against my ribs so hard I thought it would burst right through my skin. The heavy, metallic click of the deadbolt turning felt like a judge's gavel coming down on my life. In a frantic, chaotic blur of adrenaline, we scrambled. Marcus practically threw himself off the sofa, stumbling over his own feet as he reached for his discarded shirt on the rug. I rolled off the cushions, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grab the hem of my blouse to pull it down. My mind was screaming, a deafening siren of panic. David is home. He wasn't supposed to be here for another 4 hours. His flight was supposed to be delayed. The heavy wooden front door swung open, and the warm, humid Texas night air rushed into the foyer, bringing with it the familiar scent of the outdoors. But inside, the air felt toxic, thick with the undeniable stench of our betrayal. "Hey, babe, surprise!" David's voice called out, carrying that familiar, upbeat tone that usually made my heart melt. He dropped his heavy black roller bag onto the hardwood floor with a dull thud and kicked the door shut behind him. "The airline managed to get us onto an earlier connection out of Dallas. I tried calling you from the tarmac, but it went straight to voicemail." I stood there in the center of the living room, my legs feeling like lead, my hands buried deep in my pockets so he wouldn't see them shaking. I tried to force my breathing to slow down, but my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. I managed to paste a fragile, tight smile onto my face, though I knew my eyes probably looked frantic. "David?" I choked out, my voice sounding incredibly thin, foreign even to my own ears. You're home early." David walked around the partition wall into the living room, unbuttoning the top button of his dress shirt, a tired but happy smile on his face. He looked exhausted from a week of running around construction sites in the desert heat, dark circles shadowing his eyes. But his smile vanished the moment he looked at the two of us. The scene was damning, even if he didn't have the proof yet. Marcus was standing near the hallway, his shirt on but completely unbuttoned, his hair wildly disheveled, frantically trying to look like he had just been relaxing on the couch. The cushions on the sofa were completely displaced, the throw pillows tossed onto the floor. The air was charged with a heavy, vibrating silence that you could practically cut with a knife. David's gaze shifted slowly from me, down to the messy couch, and then over to Marcus, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. "What's going on? Is everything okay?" Yeah, man, totally," Marcus stammered, his voice a pitch higher than normal. He gave a forced, awkward laugh that sounded incredibly guilty. We were actually looking for my wallet. I thought it slipped down into the couch cushions earlier. I was tearing the place apart looking for it." It was a terrible lie, a pathetic, transparent excuse. I watched David's expression change in real time, transitioning from confusion to a cold, sharp skepticism. David is an engineer. He analyzes patterns for a living. He looked at Marcus's unbuttoned shirt, then looked at me. He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto mine. I felt like a criminal under a spotlight. I knew what he was seeing. My lipstick was completely smudged, my collar was askew, and I was breathing too hard. "Your wallet?" David repeated, his voice dropping an octave, losing all of its warmth. He didn't look at Marcus anymore. He kept his eyes strictly on me. "In the dark?"
The lights aren't even on in here. I had forgotten that we hadn't turned the lamps on. The room was only illuminated by the pale blue glow of the television screen and the moonlight filtering through the blinds. "I just got home, David," I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I walked in and Marcus was looking for his ID. We were just about to turn the lights on. "I'm just stressed from work. It's been a really long day." David didn't say a word. He just stood there, looking at me with a profound sadness that cut deeper than any anger could have. The silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity. He looked at the couch again, then back at his best friend and his wife. He wasn't stupid. He could put the pieces together. The sudden shifts in tone over the phone the past 2 weeks, the way I'd sound distant, the way Marcus had been staying with us far longer than the initial 2 weeks we had agreed upon. It was all clicking into place for him. "Marcus," David said, his voice terrifyingly calm, devoid of any emotion. "Get your things." Marcus blinked, taking a step back. "Dave, come on, man, it's not what you think." I said, "Get your things. Now." David interrupted, his voice cracking slightly on the last word, a sudden flash of raw, unadulterated fury breaking through his calm exterior. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer intensity of it made Marcus stop instantly. Marcus looked at me, a silent, cowardly plea for help in his eyes. "But I couldn't save him. I couldn't even save myself." Marcus swallowed hard, nodded slowly, and walked down the hallway toward the guest bathroom where he kept his duffel bag. Once Marcus left the room, David finally looked back at me. The anger vanished, replaced by a raw, bleeding vulnerability that broke my heart into a million pieces. "Tell me you didn't," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Please, Sarah, look me in the eye and tell me nothing happened." I looked at him, my vision blurring with sudden, hot tears. I wanted to lie. God, I wanted to lie so badly. I wanted to tell him that Marcus had forced himself on me, or that it was just a misunderstanding, or that we were just hugging. But looking at David, the man who had loved me unconditionally, the man who had built a life with me, I couldn't do it. The weight of my own guilt suffocated the lies in my throat. I broke down, covering my face with my hands, my shoulders shaking as a sob escaped my chest. That sob was all the confession he needed. David stumbled backward a step, as if he'd been physically struck in the chest. He let out a ragged, broken breath, a sound of absolute devastation that will haunt me until the day I die. He turned his back to me, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter so tightly his knuckles turned white. Within 5 minutes, Marcus came back into the living room, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his shoes hurriedly tied. He didn't look at either of us. He walked straight to the front door, opened it, and stepped out into the night, shutting the door quietly behind him. The sound of his car engine starting and speeding down the suburban street left a vacuum of absolute horror in our home. David slowly turned around to face me. The tenderness, the love, the warmth that had defined our entire relationship
was completely gone. His eyes were cold, dead, and empty. "I'm leaving," he said flatly. "David, please," I begged, taking a step toward him, my hand outstretched. "Please don't go. Let me explain. It was a mistake. It was a terrible mistake. I don't love him. I love you." "Don't fucking touch me," he snarled, flinching away from me as if my touch were poison. "Do not fucking touch me, Sarah." He grabbed his roller bag, the wheels clicking loudly against the floor, and walked out the front door without looking back. The next 48 hours were a blur of absolute desolation. I stayed awake all night, sitting on the edge of our bed, staring at the empty space where David should have been sleeping. The silence in the house was no longer comforting. It felt heavy, suffocating, like a thick layer of dust settling over everything we had built. I kept my phone clutched in my hand, staring at the screen until my eyes burned, hoping, praying for a text, a call, an angry notification, anything that meant he was still willing to talk to me. But there was nothing.
Every call I made went straight to voicemail, and every text message remained unread, a desperate string of blue bubbles pleading into a void. By Friday afternoon, the guilt had mutated into a frantic, sickly panic. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and the ambient noise of the suburban neighborhood outside, kids playing, lawnmowers running, felt completely surreal, like life was continuing for everyone else, while my world had stopped entirely. I knew I couldn't just sit in the empty house anymore. I got into my car and drove down to the hotel near the tech corridor where David's company usually booked rooms for visiting executives. I didn't even know if he was there, but it was the only place I could think of. When I walked into the sleek, modern lobby, my heart was in my throat. I stood near the elevators for an hour, feeling like a stalker, until the glass doors slid open and I saw him. He was wearing the same clothes from Thursday night, wrinkled and exhausted, holding a cardboard cup of coffee. He looked like a ghost of himself. "David," I breathed, stepping into his path before he could reach the reception desk. He stopped dead in his tracks. For a second, a flash of that familiar warmth crossed his face, an instinctual reaction to seeing his wife, but it was instantly crushed by a cold, hard barrier of resentment. He looked around the lobby, clearly embarrassed, before locking his eyes onto mine. "What are you doing here, Sarah?" he asked, his voice completely flat, drained of any life. "You wouldn't answer my calls," I said, tears instantly stinging my eyes. I reached out to touch his arm, but he took a deliberate step back, crossing his arms over his chest. The rejection felt like a physical slap. "David, please. We can't end things like this. 4 years of marriage, 6 years together. You can't just throw it away over one horrible, stupid moment of weakness." David let out a dry, humorless laugh that made me flinch. "A moment of weakness? Sarah, you didn't just trip and fall onto him. He was living in our house, my best friend. I was flying out every week to build a life for us, working 15-hour days in the heat, and the entire time, you two were playing house in the living room I paid for." "No, it wasn't like that, I swear," I sobbed, lowering my voice as a couple of hotel guests walked past us, staring. "Nothing happened until that night, I swear to you, David. It was a buildup of loneliness, of stress, and I made a terrible choice. I don't care about him. Marcus means nothing to me." "That almost makes it worse," David said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet whisper. He stepped closer, and for the first time, I saw the blinding fury behind his eyes. "If he meant something, if you were in love with him, at least there would be some twisted logic to it. But you destroyed our marriage, you humiliated me, you violated our home. For someone who means nothing to you? How am I supposed to ever look at you and see the woman I loved? We can go to therapy. We can figure this out," I begged, the desperation making me sound pathetic. "People get past this. Couples survive this. Please, David, just come home. Let's talk about it." David stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. The anger in his face slowly dissolved back into that profound, crushing sadness.
He looked at me as if he were looking at a stranger wearing his wife's face. "I did go back to the house this morning," he said quietly, "while you were out. I grabbed some more of my clothes." My breath caught in my throat. "And?" "And I sat on that couch," he said, a tear finally escaping his eye and rolling down his cheek. "I sat there and I tried to imagine a future where I could sit in that room, watch TV with you, or have a normal evening without seeing the two of you together. And I couldn't do it, Sarah. Every time I look at you, every time I think about our home, all I feel is sick. I feel like I'm drowning." "David, please." "I've already contacted a lawyer," he said, the words cutting through the air like a guillotine. "I'm filing for separation. I need you to pack up Marcus's things, if he left anything behind. And honestly, I think it's best if you figure out where you're going to live. I want to sell the house." The word sell echoed in my ears. The mid-century ranch. The kitchen we remodeled ourselves. The backyard with the old oak tree. Our future completely liquidated. "Don't do this," I whispered, the tears flooding down my face. "Please don't do this to us." "You already did it, Sarah," David said softly. He didn't wait for me to reply. He turned around, walked past the reception desk, and headed straight for the elevators. I watched the silver doors close behind him, cutting off my view of the man I loved, leaving me entirely alone in a crowded hotel lobby, holding the shattered remnants of a life I had single-handedly destroyed. I drove back to the house in a trance. The drive was a blur. When I walked through the front door, the reality of what he had said hit me like a physical wave. The house felt like a crime scene. I walked into the living room, looking at the sofa, remembering the heat of Marcus's hands, the thrill of the betrayal, and the sudden violent crash of David's arrival. It felt like a completely different person had made those choices, a reckless, selfish phantom that had hijacked my body for a few weeks, but the consequences were entirely mine to bear. I walked over to the guest closet and found a small canvas bag that Marcus had left behind, filled with some old sneakers and charging cables. I grabbed it, intending to throw it in the trash, when my phone vibrated in my hand. My heart leaped, thinking it was David. But when I looked at the screen, my stomach dropped into a cold, dark abyss. It was a text from Marcus. "Hey, I know everything is messed up right now,
But I can't stop thinking about you. We need to talk. I'm staying at a motel off the highway. Come see me tonight." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, the letters of Marcus's text blurring before my eyes. The sheer audacity of it made me feel physically ill. He was staying at a sleazy motel off the highway, hiding out like a coward, and he wanted me to come see him. He wanted to talk about us, as if there was an us to salvage from the wreckage of my life. In that moment, the fog of confusion and longing that had clouded my judgment for weeks completely vanished, replaced by a sharp, piercing clarity. Marcus hadn't loved me. He hadn't even cared about me. He was a parasite who had taken advantage of my loneliness, my weakness, and the hospitality of a man who had treated him like a brother. He had looked David in the eye every single day, drank his beer, ate his food, and then reached for his wife the second his back was turned. And I had let him. I had welcomed the destruction into my own home. I didn't reply to the text. Instead, I grabbed the canvas bag of his leftover belongings, walked out to the garage, and threw it violently into the bottom of the plastic trash bin. I slammed the lid down, wishing it were that easy to shut out the memories of what we had done. The next few months were a masterclass in slow, agonizing endurance. David's lawyer moved with a cold, terrifying efficiency. Because we lived in Texas, a state where fault in a breakup can heavily impact the division of assets, the legal process felt less like a negotiation and more like a systematic dismantling of my existence. I didn't fight back. I didn't contest the terms, the asset splits, or the fast-track timeline. I signed every document his attorney slid across the polished conference table, never looking David in the eye because he refused to look at me.
He sat on the opposite side of the room, flanked by counsel, staring straight ahead at the wall, treating me like an adversarial corporation rather than the woman he had promised to love forever. By late August, the mid-century ranch house was officially put on the market. Packing up that house was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. Every box I taped up felt like a coffin for a specific memory. In the kitchen, I wrapped the coffee mugs we'd bought on our honeymoon in Maui. In the bedroom, I packed away the linens that still faintly smelled of the laundry detergent David liked. The hardest room to face was the living room. I stood in the center of the empty space, the sofa gone, sold to a random stranger online, leaving only 4 dark indents in the hardwood floor where the legs had rested. I knelt down and touched the wood, crying until my throat was raw, mourning the exact spot where my life had fractured beyond repair. The house sold in less than 2 weeks to a young couple expecting their first child.
I saw them walking through the property during the final walkthrough, holding hands, pointing at the old oak tree in the backyard, talking about building a swing set. They looked so happy, so innocent, so entirely convinced that their love was indestructible. I wanted to warn them. I wanted to tell them how fragile it all is, how easily a life can be ruined by a single sequence of terrible decisions. But I just took my keys, handed them to the real estate agent, and walked away. I moved into a small, sterile one-bedroom apartment on the northern edge of the city. It has white walls, laminate flooring, and a view of a busy intersection. There are no memories here, which is both a blessing and a curse. It's a clean slate, but it feels incredibly cold. I spend most of my evenings working late at the agency, throwing myself into marketing campaigns and client strategies just to keep my mind from wandering into the dark corners of the past. I haven't seen Marcus since that Thursday night. I blocked his number, deleted his social media, and cut off the mutual college friends who tried to ask me what had happened. I heard through the grapevine a few weeks ago that he moved back to Ohio, taking a low-level sales job and living with his parents. The charming, untouchable golden boy had finally run out of luck, leaving a trail of absolute devastation in his wake. I don't hate him anymore. Hate requires energy, and I am far too exhausted for that.
Mostly, I just feel a profound, hollow pity for both of us. Sometimes when the apartment gets too quiet, I drive down to the old neighborhood late at night. I park my car a few houses down from our old ranch home and just watch it from behind the steering wheel. The new family has put up warm yellow curtains in the front windows. They installed a tire swing on the oak tree. The house looks alive again, washed clean of the sins that Marcus and I had stained it with. I know I will eventually move on. I know that time is supposed to heal these kinds of wounds, or at least cover them up with enough scar tissue that it stops hurting to breathe. I've started going to therapy, trying to understand the deep-seated insecurities and the reckless impulses that drove me to sabotage my own happiness. I'm learning to forgive myself, though some days that feels like an impossible task. But the hardest part isn't the loneliness, or the apartment, or the legal fees. The hardest part is knowing that somewhere out there, in this city or another, David is waking up alone. He is brewing a pot of coffee for one, living with a cynical, hardened heart because the person he trusted most in the world proved to be a liar. I didn't just lose my husband, I destroyed a good man's ability to trust, and that is a debt I will be paying back to the universe for the rest of my life.